Hello! Welcome to another teacher support video from FoodPrints. The goal of this video series is to provide you, our amazing teachers, with important information that will help you teach various FoodPrints lessons. So, a big thanks to you for taking the time to join us today. Okay, the big idea you'll be communicating to your students through this lesson is the structures of fruits and flowers help them reproduce. This lesson involves hands-on flower and fruit dissections. The goal is for students to observe and learn about two things: the process of pollination and the plant parts that enable plant reproduction. That's why this lesson is called, you guessed it, Pollination and Plant Reproduction. And this lesson is for fourth graders. One of the challenges with teaching science to young students is the terminology. Very often, the words can be tough for students to pronounce or remember. This particular lesson is a good example, as it uses the proper vocabulary to describe various plant parts and the role they play in pollination and plant reproduction. If some of these words are new to you, take a moment to familiarize yourself with them before beginning the lesson. The more comfortable you are with the vocabulary, the better equipped you'll be to help your students learn the subject matter. The first word we want to define is pollination. Simply put, pollination is the process of transferring pollen from the male reproductive part of a flower to the female reproductive parts. Without pollination, plants wouldn't be able to reproduce or produce fruits and vegetables. So it's a critical process. And it all happens in the flower. Almost every plant that produces fruits or vegetables, like tomato plants, cucumber vines, blueberry bushes, apple trees, and on, every one of those plants uses its flower to create its product, or reproduce. Of course, not all flowers are the same. Some flowers have male parts, some flowers have female parts, and some have both. Those are the ones that can self-pollinate. But for the purpose of this fourth grade lesson, we won't get into those distinctions. We'll just stick to the basics of pollination. And to get started, let's name some flower parts. This is what we refer to as the parts of a flower graphic that we use in FoodPrints. And these are the terms you'll need to know for this lesson. First up, the petals, which attract pollinators with their beautiful colors. Now, the male parts of the flower. The anther, which makes pollen, and the filament, which provides support for the anther. Together, these two male parts are known as the stamen. Now to the female parts. The stigma is at the top of this tube. The tube is called the style. Below the style is the ovary, and inside the ovary is the ovule. Together, these four female parts are known as the pistil. So, how does pollination happen? It starts when a flower creates pollen, and that pollen is created by the anther, which is the top part of the stamen. That pollen needs to get to the stigma, and for that, most flowers need a little help. Sometimes that help comes from the wind, but more often it comes from pollinators, such as butterflies, bats, and insects like bees. When the pollinators, which are hunting for the flower's delicious nectar, rub against the anther, the pollen starts to move around and stick to their bodies. The pollinators then come into contact with the pistil, and the pollen is captured by the sticky top of the pistil called the stigma. The pollen then travels down the style, which is the tube part of the pistil. At the base of the pistil, the pollen enters the ovary. And it's inside the ovary that the pollen finally performs a very important job. It fertilizes the ovule. This is important because fertilizing the ovule is what allows a seed to be created. And of course, seeds are how plants reproduce. Once fertilization happens, the petals, stamen, and pistil of a flower have all done their jobs, and they begin to fall from the flower. The last step in this process is that the wall of the ovary begins to form what's called a pericarp, or flesh, around the seed to protect it. This pericarp is what you and I know as the fruit of a vegetable of the plant, usually the part we eat. Eventually, the seeds are dispersed, which allows the plant to reproduce in new places. This dispersal of the seeds happens in a variety of ways: by water, by the wind, by sticking to things and hitching a ride, or by being eaten and passing through the digestive systems of animals. The hands-on portion of this 4th grade lesson is dissection. And it's one of my favorite activities because it fills the classroom with beautiful flowers. In this activity, students will cut into a flower and attempt to identify the various reproductive parts we just discussed. It's important to remember, while many of the reproductive parts are easily seen with the naked eye, smaller parts like the ovary and ovule might be a bit tougher for kids to see and identify. That's why we suggest you use flowers with large reproductive parts, such as daffodils or gladioli, or these I have here, lilies, alstroemeria, and tulips. When it's time to dissect, just dive right in and open the flower up as needed. For the smaller sections, it's probably a good idea to have a pair of scissors or a sharp knife available to make fine cuts. And remember, if your students can't easily see every flower part we mentioned earlier, that's okay, because the goal of this lesson is simply to give students a basic overview of the pollination and reproductive process. Also during this lesson, feel free to have students dissect some fruits with seeds inside. That way, they'll be able to make the connection between flowers, seeds, and fruits. A great option for fruit dissection is pomegranate, which often still has the flower parts attached to the blossom end and has very obvious seeds inside. Making the connection between pollination and plant reproduction is an exciting challenge for young learners. With the hands-on investigations in this lesson, your students will learn so much and have a lot of fun. And that's all for pollinators and plant reproduction. Thank you so much for joining me today. See you next time.